what I'm thinking around this idea of the how we work with stakeholders, particularly how that work is improving evidence use and impact. And I guess a thing that's weighing on my mind is whether we now talk in this area quite a lot about co-production, but whether we're really talking about anything different here. And if we were talking about something different, would that really help us make a difference in terms of transforming the relationship between research in the academy and also kind of policy and practice? So, as Julia kindly reminded, I've been doing this for quite a long time now, but most recently I've been working in the Government Office for Science a couple of days a week as a knowledge broker. And so having an opportunity to practice what I've been thinking about for a long time, and that's been an amazing opportunity. And I will talk a little bit about that as I go through. But what I'm planning to cover is a little bit about just how we think stakeholders support the use of evidence. So what's the kind of underlying theory there? What some of the approaches are we use, what the key challenges are. And I'm also going to share with you some principles for better engagement with stakeholders from some work that I'm doing with Steve Hannay and colleagues. And then I want to talk a little bit about the potential of a more co-productive approach in the form of something called research practice partnerships and how that might potentially be different in terms of this way that we work with our stakeholders. So just to start out, thinking about how stakeholders might actually make a difference. This might be for a lot of different reasons. I think it's worth articulating these up front. So we may work with our stakeholders for example, to think about the priority areas we work on. What are the things that matter? There's some really interesting stuff on Twitter today about how many clinical trials address things that are of no interest to patients in terms of primary outcomes. We've still got a long way to go in terms of thinking around what really are the things that matter to people who are using services and people in policy roles who are thinking about services for the future. We also can use stakeholder engagement to think about what actually needs to change. So what might the kind of policies and practices look like? So not just what the solutions look like, but how we might get there. And to think about how we implement new ideas generally. I mean, that's a really interesting and growing area for working with stakeholders. What approaches to stakeholder engagement are going to make a difference? We might use our stakeholder engagement to think about local needs. We might use it to actually enhance capacity to engage with change. We might just do it because we're told to do it by our funders. And we might do it because we think it aligns with our kind of ethics in terms of practice. If we're doing research that's going to make a difference to people, we should listen to them and bring their views into the process. So lots of different reasons why engaging with stakeholders might make a difference to our research in terms of its potential for use. So I feel there's quite a strong case there from lots of different angles. But then the way we go about it is very varied. So when I first started working in this area, we talked about consultation all the time. And this is a spectrum of participation developed in Canada. And in that context, they're not suggesting that any of these are bigger or better than the others, but that you might use different approaches for different projects with different goals at different times with different resources. So that it might many times be okay just to be informing people about the work that you're doing and making sure they know that there's important research going on in their area. At other times, you might want to do a quick bit of consultation to get a sense of whether you're going in the right direction. At other times, you might have the kind of capacity and time to do something more inclusive, to work more in a more engaged way with people. And very occasionally, you might actually have the scope to do something truly collaborative, where the agendas are set at the start in a more co-produced way and where you work together and engage with people throughout the process. So I think one of the things we've done in this area is privilege one of these approaches over others, and particularly at the moment, the talk of co-production, saying, that will be the biggest and best way we can do this work. But I think I would argue that it depends what you're trying to do and what you've got to do it with, and how much scope there actually is for people's voices to really shape the work that we're doing. Many times we're engaging in research for government departments, for example, who've set the parameters of the study pretty tightly. We may not have that scope to really involve people in an authentic way in setting the direction of how we do the work. So different approaches fit different needs, contexts, and different groups. Anyone who's done any stakeholder engagement work, and I will be really interested to hear about your experiences later on, will see that there are many key challenges to working in this way. Particularly, I guess, the methods we use. We are way too keen to set up a meeting and bring people into our space, come to our not particularly nice meeting space in our not particularly well set out universities. Come and join us on our territory to hear about what we're doing. Often we aren't thinking about some of the more creative ways we can engage with people, and to talk a bit later about working with colleagues who are co-designers, which has been really amazing for thinking about, actually, you don't always have to bring people to sit in a 4-hour research meeting. So have we thought about processes that really value and engage people's perspectives? I remember doing a study where we were interviewing patients who'd been involved in biomedical research, and someone coming out of a day-long meeting and saying, I've really had an amazing experience there. It was really interesting. No one asked for my opinion. No one spoke to me, but I got something out of sitting there. And that isn't really the goals we have when we often set up opportunities to engage with stakeholders. But if we don't set up a process that values and engages with people's input, then they come along and sit in our meeting and go away, maybe feeling a little puzzled about what we do, but certainly not having an opportunity to fundamentally shape the work. If we're going to do this kind of work, we know that it's time and resource intensive. So have we really worked this in? And I think this is a particular challenge, not just in terms of how we work as researchers, but how the funding we receive sets out how we're going to deliver something. And I'll return to that with an example later. And actually, I guess how we reconcile the different interests of stakeholders. A lot of the work we do with stakeholders is based on this idea of consensus, but actually often there are important differences of opinion, and we need to hold on to those in the process and not assume that the key thing is to reconcile those differences, but to understand those differences and what they mean for research if it's going to be used down the line. And then I guess this issue about power, are we really talking about shifting power to our stakeholders and working with them in an authentic co-producing way? I'm not sure that's often the case. I mean, most of the time, I think we're bringing people to come in and work on our agenda, on our time scale, and we probably want to hold on to most of that power. But you may disagree. I'd be interested to hear. Okay, so I wanted to talk about a couple of projects as examples. And this first one, I see Robert. Hi, Robert is in the room, who worked with me on this study. It was interesting when Julia was introducing me at the start that we often talk about a kind of individual work on something like transforming evidence, but all the work I've done has been with really great colleagues, and those insights from this more collaborative way of working is important. So this was a study that Robert and I were involved in, where we were looking at a piece of work, a European piece of work, where they developed a kind of an intervention in the UK for reducing smoking. It was a tool for providers to use to think about how they spent their money on smoking services. So it was a really interesting intervention. It had lots of EU funding, and the idea was to implement this intervention in different European countries. So there was an awful lot of stakeholder involvement built into this study. They had a theory of change for the study that fundamentally placed this idea of working and co-creating at the heart of the work that they were doing. They had lots of work package space to work with stakeholders, and a lot of commitment from the team from their previous projects and experience to working in this way. So experience that showed them they're listening to stakeholders and made a difference to how they did their research. So from day one, this looked like a pretty positive piece of work. There was lots of kind of investment there in all those different ways. And what we were doing in our study was tracking over time how that stakeholder engagement panned out as the study was implemented across Europe. So what we found was, over time, the actual engagement with stakeholders subtly shifted. So at the start, there was a clear idea that the stakeholders were partners, people to co-produce with, to work with in an authentic way. But over time, for a very wide range of reasons, actually, that stakeholder engagement turned into something that was much more consultative. So they went from the idea of having lots of stakeholder meetings, bringing together people to talk together, to an online tool using what was kind of the new technology at the time, which was Skype, to actually and interviewing people on a one-to-one basis. So the idea they would bring stakeholders together and they would talk together was lost in the process. And that was partly to do with the comfort of the team to work in a particular way, but also the funder had a very hard deadline for the project, and the project was delayed. So there was an idea, well, actually, we can do this so much more efficiently if we do it on a one-to-one basis. So actually, the data that was collected became much more routinized and much more like a standard consultation. And then there was a further kind of morphing in the process towards the end, where the stakeholders came together.
Doing a live webinar.
And when the stakeholders came together for one of the final meetings, they presented the data from these consultations and presented the idea that actually, given the data being collected in such a rigorous way, it could actually be written up as research, as a scientific publication. And so the final turn in the journey was the team, quite gleefully, really, noticing that what they'd started out with as kind of stakeholder engagement had become research that would be publishable in a peer-reviewed journal. And there were so many different pressures that helped the team go in that direction, but it was so far from the original vision, which was something authentically co-produced. And many different factors took them down this line, but at the point where it became research and what we would probably describe as more extractive in terms of actually the knowledge of those stakeholders, there was a kind of a sort of sense of comfort in the room that actually the work had reached a place where everybody felt, actually this is what we do and we're happy to do. So there are a lot of challenges in this process, even when you start out with really good intentions. So the second thing I wanted to talk about is the work that we've been doing in government. And these are a couple of blogs which we've written around working to engage academic policy stakeholders to support evidence use. And this is some work we did at the beginning of the pandemic, where each government department identifies things called areas of research interest. And what we did was put all of those areas of research interest across all government departments together and identified kind of key priority themes. And the idea behind doing that was to say, once we're through with the pandemic in terms of a clinical and health service delivery challenge, what are the things we need to know in terms of evidence help us rebuild? So this works in Britain. So it has themes on, for example, supporting services, vulnerable communities. There's one on land use, and there's another one on trade and aid. So some very interesting kind of project groups. This was group work that was done online with academics, policymakers, government analysts, and research funders coming together. And the idea of them coming together was that they would talk about where the kind of gaps were in the literature, so where more research might need to be commissioned, but also to synthesize what we knew already, because we're often a bit quick to kind of, from a government perspective, to think we need to fund more research. But on each of these topics, this engagement work was about saying, what do we know already about these questions we know government are interested in? What we've drawn from this work, and we've written up in these blogs, though, is just how much hard labour is involved in doing stakeholder engagement with policy. Not that there's a lack of interest and engagement from all the different stakeholders, actually, but to do this work involved a huge amount of kind of skill time from within the civil service, from intermediary and broker organisations such as the UK Work Centres, who helped us a lot. We work with the University Policy Engagement Network, who helped us, in effect, identify a larger kind of community that we could sample from to bring academics into these groups. And the reason we did that was that there's a bit of a danger with academic policy engagement is when you do more, you just do more with the same people. And we were really interested in trying to bring some diversity into our academic engagement. So we wanted to try and find opportunities to bring in early career researchers and researchers from across the UK. We did quite a lot of work to support, for example, female academics who during the pandemic had a lot of additional responsibilities. So we had a number of female academics who were participating with a more junior colleague as a buddy so that they could participate in the process with the sort of slightly more limited time they had available. So I wanted to share this example of kind of just how much work we need to do if we want to do really good academic policy engagement to support evidence use. This is something that we really need to work into our kind of program of work. We need to plan well, and we need to resource. And so one of the common bits of feedback we had from academics who work with us on this process was that they actually were doing it in their spare time and with goodwill, rather than drawing on kind of resources within their organisation to support this kind of work. So they were doing it because they thought it was important, and they were doing it in their spare time. And I don't think those are positive messages we want to put out about academic engagement. Okay, so I just wanted to share some of the things we do know about stakeholder engagement, because I think it's useful to recognise that people have been doing a lot of work over many years to synthesise kind of key principles for stakeholder engagement. And this is based on a review of some of the stakeholder engagement literature, where we distilled 15 design principles to think through when you're thinking about stakeholder engagement. I'm going to go through these quite fast, but I just wanted to share them with you now. And the first set are organizational. So we often don't think at an organizational level about the role of stakeholder engagement, and it's really brilliant that you're thinking about this at Greenwich, about actually, as an organization, how can we be ready to use this stakeholder engagement mechanism in our work? And a key part of that is being clear of why you're doing it. And sometimes it's for many different reasons. Really clear what it means to the organization to engage with stakeholders around research use, to also embed it in any kind of frameworks or models or strategies and plans the organization has, so it sits there rather than typically being a parallel activity that people work on. To identify the resourcing for it. We're not talking about large amounts of money to support people to engage with their stakeholders, but it does have resource implications, and particularly resource implications when we're talking about members of the public, patients, service users. Often there are costs involved in them working with us. And to put in place plans for organizational learning so that we learn how to do this better in the future. And also we reward people for doing this. And I think it's really nice when you see in organizations kind of, internal rewards and positive messages to kind of say that people who've done this work, it's valued by the organization. And the interesting point, I think, in terms of thinking about stakeholders is to recognize there are sometimes very key stakeholders who might want to work with us at an organizational level, may not be one who are so interested in working on individual projects, but might want to have a kind of central role within an organization, really work with us about the direction of how we do this work more generally. So after the organizational ones, we have a set around values. And I think one of the things I've increasingly recognized over doing this kind of work over the last few years is how important values are to stakeholder engagement. For many activities that we undertake, we don't talk and think about values, but actually this is often work that aligns really closely with our values, but we need to be a bit clearer about that. And that kind of idea of the shared commitment to the values and objectives of stakeholder engagement across a project team is really critical. In the example I shared earlier on the smoking project, that shared value around stakeholder engagement did not exist. So although 4 of the 5 work packages in the study had a really strong and positive idea around stakeholder engagement, one of the projects very much saw it as a kind of very individual-based activity and was very keen to turn it into research when they saw the opportunity. So that idea about kind of understanding stakeholder engagement, I guess, is often about more than individuals is key. So we often think about key people, but really we're often thinking about linking to key organizations or initiatives. And that has an implication for the refreshing of our stakeholder engagement, where people move on and move around the system, and also how we think about the people we work with most closely. Those organizational roles are really critical. So in encouraging stakeholders and their organizations to also value engagement so that everyone feels this is really important. And there's an interesting point that comes up from the literature about potential tension between productivity and inclusion. So this is the idea that actually one of the big things we do is we obviously, particularly for our funders, want to get work done to time. But often to be really inclusive, we need to be able to flex that timing to really hear from people and to take on board their perspectives. And so that can give a bit of attention in a project, but it's a really critical one to address and to be in terms of values is generating a shared commitment to a kind of sustained and continuous stakeholder engagement. And this very much links to what I'm going to talk about with research practice partnerships. This idea that actually what we really want to do is be building longer, more sustained relationships with our stakeholders. And what that allows us to do then when we have new projects and new ideas is to have a community that we're already engaged with and we can just hook straight into to think about new projects. The final set are around practices, the doing. And again, first one of these is around planning our stakeholder engagement project and planning it as part of the project. So we have a project at the moment where actually the stakeholder engagement stuff is starting to drift off to the side. And so we're working really hard to bring it back into the main project plan. And part of that's to do with actually being really well resourced and enough to be a kind of a whole program of work on its own, but we're really trying to pull it back. To have flexibility in our plan and our activity that allows us to think about actually accommodating engagement and also working with the outcomes of that engagement if it tells us to change project a few years ago, which was actually working with a biomedical team on a biomarker. And they had all this great science around this biomarker. But when we talked to people who use services in this particular area around what they could do with this biomarker, it didn't meet anything they were interested in. The outcomes they were interested in were around other things. And so it was a really great bit of science, but wasn't answering a question that kind of people using services were interested in. To consider how the input of stakeholders can be gathered in a more systematic way. So are we just throwing it in, well, now an electronic file, or are we actually using those views? And if we've got a plan to use it, how we're going to kind of analyze and collate it is really important and can be quite challenging, particularly these areas I mentioned where there's actually not a consensus among stakeholders. How do we work with those different ideas? And then finally, I guess, recognizing the identification and involvement of stakeholders as iterative and ongoing. So this idea, we need to keep coming back to thinking about this as not a one-off, but how we work going forwards. So I just wanted to share with you something that we use a lot in our transforming evidence work, which is the work of Alan Best and Bev Holmes, who argue that we started out having a very linear view of evidence use. So you write your paper, you publish it, and you push it out there, and you might kind of, do a workshop or a seminar and job done. So they argue that that was a first generation of thinking about evidence and impact. The second one is much more relational. It's about building relationships and connections. And this is where our work on stakeholder engagement sits. It's about seeing the work of promoting evidence use as fundamentally relational work. And I think we're there. That's where we are. That's why we're having this discussion. We get that there's really important relationships that underpin the use of evidence. What they do go on to argue, though, is that although you need to carry on doing all this dissemination and relational work, there are systems challenges to the use of evidence, and these need addressing too. So they might be about things like how the systems, reward impact, as I mentioned earlier, infrastructure and posts, and also, as I'm going to finish off by talking about, maybe thinking about new ways we produce evidence that kind of actually fundamentally challenge the systems that we work in. So ambitious stuff. So I just want to finish off by talking about a project we're a year into a 4-year project funded by NHR. And what we're doing here is building 3 new research practice partnerships. So this is an idea that comes from the US, where they've used it a lot, particularly in education, but also a bit in social work and in mental health services. And the idea behind this is you're building long-term, fundamentally kind of trusting, mutual relationships with stakeholders in a partnership. And as part of that partnership, you agree together where you do research and you agree on the goals of that research, and you kind of, some of it you'll deliver together and some of it the researchers will deliver, and you build capacity from all the different stakeholders in the process to understand each other's world and work well together. So this is what I would think is sort of more aligns with what Gibbons talks about as mode 2 knowledge production. This is a different way of thinking about how we produce evidence. It's away from the kind of the ownership of the academy. It's away from a kind of, peer review as the quality control. It's away from a kind of idea that the research sits in one place, but to try and move away from that model to be fundamentally sharing an agenda around research and working together, and that inherently being about impact down the line, that we're going to do research that's more useful, more usable, and ultimately also used. So that's the goal behind this work, and it hasn't been used a lot in the UK. So what we're doing with this money is we're setting up 3 new partnerships, as I mentioned. They're all up in Lancashire. There's one in Newcastle and one in Chester. And we've also got a substantial evaluation package led by LSE, where we're going to try and understand how these partnerships operate in terms of how they help people have better impact with their work. But the most exciting part of the project so far has been working with designers, because we'd sort of built in quite substantial. We wanted to learn from this US model, but we also weren't sure how well it would land in the UK. And we're also doing this work in the care home sector. So taking it from across a geography and also taking it into a different delivery context. So we've done a lot of work with international and sector experts to deliver a kind of a blueprint for what an adult social care research practice partnership might look like. And then in the second phase, we're taking that model out to each of the 3 sites, and we're developing a a kind of area specific blueprint for what their partnership might look like. And what's been great about this is how incredibly freeing it's been working with designers, a very different way of thinking about how we put a kind of promising intervention around evidence use into practice, and how we think about working with partners right through this co-design process. So they send out sort of really engaging materials to the co-design partners. We've played lots of kind of games. We've spent time developing kind of principles and ideas. It's just been really refreshing compared to how I've done a lot of work with stakeholders in the past. So the idea we brought is that we're going to work with stakeholders to develop these partnerships that themselves are going to be fundamentally about working better with stakeholders going forward. So I guess there are different ways design thinking, for the many of you will probably know design thinking already, but for me, I guess I've often spent a lot of time thinking about the design of interventions, but user-centered design can also be used as we're doing here on our implementation strategy. So how are we going to implement this model in practice? And also, interestingly, I think we can work better with designers to also think about outcomes, to user-centered design those outcomes for projects as well. So where are we in this process at the moment? So we've just finished the first bit of co-design where we work with these international and sector experts, and we took them through a reflexive activity, a seminar. We've then had a couple of workshops with them and to develop up materials for each of the site. And now we're at the place where we're working with each of the three sites to think about, well, actually, what are their different projects going to look like going forward? And it's going to be really interesting to see how these different sites co-design their own partnership. Right, so that's I've had my half an hour. I'm just going to summarize, I guess, what I hope I've covered today. So I think stakeholder engagement is often overlooked, but I think we're really making progress on that to see it as something that's potentially valuable to us, and that it has many different advantages, actually, improving implementation being one of them, but also I think helping us just understand what it means to do better work and to do better work with our kind of very broad range of stakeholders in mind. I think thinking about stakeholders as our key partners is really critical, and seeing them as people we get on board right at the start. And one of the great things I think about the change in kind of funders' perspectives is they're now expecting us to have really involved our stakeholders prior to putting in funding applications. So that opportunity to shape what we ask for money about, as well as what sort of going out in a panic once we've got some money. So I think that's a great shift that's come from our funders. As many of you will have observed, it comes with quite a lot of challenges because often we don't get the funding. So we build these really exciting, authentic kind of partnerships with communities, and then there's no money to do it. So it isn't without its challenges. I think we may be, we're using this language of co-production a lot at the moment, and this worries me because I really don't think most of the time we're doing co-production. But if we are, it's great to call it out and say we've kind of brought about this big change in how we do work. But I think most of the time we're just rebadging something that would look much more like consultation to someone on the outside. I think stakeholder engagement can be super time and resource intensive, and so we need to build that in, and we need to support it from within our institutions. We need to say this is something we do as part of our research process, and here are the resources to make that happen. And also that we need to capture the outcomes of stakeholder engagement so we know what to do better in the future, and that's why I think it's so important to have buy-in at an organisational level. So finally, just do a quick plug for Transforming Evidence. If no one's had a look, I'll put a link in the chat to the website, but we have been doing some work to kind of basically connect communities who are interested in evidence use and impact. We run seminars, we share resources, we share opportunities, and we want to do all this connecting and sharing expertise. And the key behind that is this is a bit of a field where we reinvent the wheel every few years and we don't move forward. And so we really want to be able to move forward our thinking on evidence use so we don't keep going around in circles. Thanks, Julia. And then we're also interested in developing collaborative research. If that interests people, just get in touch. So thank you very much, and looking forward to discussing.
Thank you so much, Annette. Do you hear background noise? What is that? Or is it just me? Okay, so yeah, thank you so much, Annette. And I put the link to Transforming Evidence in the chat. And I have, I think you were brilliant with the timing. I was like, I kind of wasn't expecting that you would finish that. But you certainly given me a lot to reflect on. I think the point that particularly resonated with me was when you said about the fact that we are constantly going around in circles and we're sort of repeating the stuff that we already know, and how do we move forward? And also something else that's really interesting that you said is that we talk a lot about co-production, but we often get stuck in. But I think I'm going to mute somebody because that's where the noise is coming from. We talk about co-production, but actually the structures that we have and the habits that we have are really about consultation rather than co-production. And so, how do we embed, if we want to do co-production, how do we embed that into structures and design it in from the get-go and so on? And how can our organizations support us? And I certainly find it difficult myself to say, oh, I'm going to do a participatory project. I'm going to co-produce from the beginning. I'm going to involve stakeholders and so on. And then I've got a turnaround of like 9 months. And, my university wants me to for me to spend the funding by this day. And, I have outputs by, the next month or whatever. And so it becomes quite difficult to deliver based on those structures. So I guess, is your perception, or do you see that the structures are changing to welcome and encourage a different kind of approach? And if so, which would be the good places to go, in terms of funding and support for us researchers?
Yeah, so I do think things are changing. So there is a much richer landscape now internationally and within the UK to support people who are interested in promoting evidence use. And our academic institutions have more infrastructure. So 10 years ago, they might have had like a ref manager, but now they often have somebody who has a broader remit to think about the knowledge mobilization of the institution's evidence. And the kind of presence of UPenn as a national university policy engagement network, connecting those people as a network is really positive. One of the challenges as you grow an infrastructure is how well those things complement and work together. So actually, you can end up with quite a lot of noise, quite a lot of people asking, for example, in my government role, multiple universities asking to run seminars with government departments. And so we do need to make sure that we're coordinating the realistically quite limited time government colleagues have to engage with researchers. So I think that's a good problem. We're at a place where we have this kind of growing infrastructure that we can engage with. So no, I do feel that's positive, and reaching out and connecting with those people within our own institutions is a great starting point. So if we have those, they often have more resource than is used, and so to connect with them and see how they can support us and to value what they're doing, because they're often a bit stuck down a corridor in the institution.
Yeah. Great point. I'm just gonna go over some of the comments that people have left in the chat and the questions too. And obviously, people feel free to interject. I'm just taking advantage of my position now to ask questions. But I think there's a comment from Nimal talking about sharing power. So we have the power and we are willing to share it with others who don't have the same power. But what power do stakeholders have when they share with us? Can we create new power together?
No, that's a great point. And I think that there is an interesting difference between our stakeholders who do have power and those that don't. I mean, when I'm sort of teaching stakeholder engagement to students, I typically use that power interest grid which suggests to you to work with your more powerful stakeholders because they bring power to your project. But what's interesting about that is it can marginalize the people who don't have power but are really interested in what you're doing and may get power because people move around and lose power, but may also not have power in the traditional sense. We may need to work with them actually to help them get some power around the project we're doing. So I think it's a really, really interesting area and something we need to address directly. And a lot of the time sounds hopelessly naive that we say we're going to share our power, because a lot of the power we have, encouraging academics to give it up, I don't think is a straightforward process. So, and which is why I do caution against some of this language if we really, to make sure we really mean it, if we're really willing to share our power out a bit.
Yeah, that is a really good point. I certainly found that difficult to negotiate in my own experience. Of like the little power I have, I kind of want it for myself because I do want my voice to be platformed, but at the same time, I'm also trying to platform the voices of people that don't have a platform, and it's a real conundrum, especially as an early career researcher. Right, the next comment is from Fatima, who said, one of our biggest challenges with stakeholder engagement, especially with policymakers, is the high turnover of staff within government institutions in our setting. It always feels like you're starting over.
Yeah, this is such an important challenge, and I think happens more at a policy level than in our kind of work with practice organisations, although that happens there as well. I think it's particularly challenging when you lose someone who's had a kind of leadership role around the work that you're doing and where you've had a really good relationship. I mean, one of the positives, though, is that those people often, if they have been very authentically engaged with the work we're doing, take it off to another role in another part of government. But I just think it is one of the ultimate challenges to doing evidence to policy work is about the starting over and actually building those kind of sometimes slightly wider networks of relationships beyond the individual because they are gone in a flash.
But I guess if we do engage with more systems thinking rather than relational, as you were saying, in terms of moving forward, then we might also overcome the problem of that change that is based on that relationship that you have with that individual, so that no matter who is in the role, that the program and the project can continue. So yeah, that would be good, wouldn't it?
It would be good. Yes.
Okay, Robert, very exciting to hear what has happened since SEE Impact. Compared to the work we did, it seems that the co-production stakeholder engagement field is now way more sensitive to the epistemic politics that are inherent to approaches like this. Could you reflect on how, in this project on research project partnerships, you approach issues about academic performance imperatives that privilege the production of a specific kind of knowledge?
Yes, it's a great question. We're definitely going to rub up against this. We're not at that stage yet. So at the moment, we found a great level of institutional support for partnerships. So, people seeing this as a brilliant idea and that they're very engaged with. How they'll feel about it when we start to produce research, and whether that research, because one of the things that's happened in research practice partnerships in education in the US is quite a lot of the projects that the kind of parents and the teachers want are really about using routine data, their own data, and help to do that, which is really valid, use of kind of research skills to help with that. So a lot of the projects haven't been chasing kind of big research awards and haven't been producing peer-reviewed papers. And that to me feels fine, but I think that does start to hit against some of these. We have a very clear academic performative culture. We know what the things we are meant to perform against are in terms of targets. And so how you reconcile that to some of the other things a partnership might do in terms of direction. But they do actually deliver on some other elements of our kind of academic role, which is often to give back to our local communities and to be more engaged and to have more kind of a sort of a narrative-based impact. So I think it will be interesting to see how much of that we encounter down the line when the projects start to generate work. There aren't very many of these, but the one that is there's a partnership up in Leeds called Niche Leeds, and they have actually managed to bring in quite a lot of research funding. So they've hit some of these targets, and the question, in my mind is, will you be able to be successful as a partnership if you haven't delivered on these very performative targets for the university? Or do you need to find some way of doing that alongside doing the other things the partnerships are interested in? But we're going to let these 3 partnerships run and see how they decide to address that challenge. And they're in very different types of institutions. So there's one, so there's Newcastle University, and then Chester University, and then Edge Hill, so the university partners are different types of universities. So that will be interesting to see.
Thank you. I think I shared the link to Niche Leads, hopefully with the right partnerships. The next point is from Athena, who's saying, regarding the choice of terms, has co-production become synonymous with stakeholder engagement? In sustainable development, project co-provision, co-design are also used.
And the same in other policy areas. So co-provision, not so much, but co-design is used quite a lot as well. So the terminological soup is definitely an issue in this area. And one of the things is to be really clear about the terms you use and what they mean to you when you're doing this kind of work. I think that can help others who are coming, because we would use in my work the term co-design, but I only really feel very comfortable using it when my design colleagues are present who really know about co-design. I've done co-design in the past with no contact with designers whatsoever. So yeah, it's being clear what you mean by these terms and how you're using them is helpful for our partners.
That's very interesting. And do you feel like your understanding of the term has changed when once you started working with designers, compared to before, or was it?
Oh no, definitely,
Yeah.
definitely, because there's a hinterland of design thinking that is very different in terms of how you engage people and how you work with them, and it has been really positive. And one of the things I've learned from this, I guess, is that we often have design colleagues in our institutions who are keen to work with us, and so that's a valuable resource we often have in house that we can draw on from other bits of our departments and faculties.
Great, taking notes. And also, let's move on to Val. Val, in securing funding and resources, can you tell us more from your experience about how to reconcile that tension between delivering traditional outputs and the need to invest time in developing co-production and allowing stakeholders to identify what outcomes and outputs are important?
Yeah, so this is difficult, isn't it? I'm still not sure how this is going to go. So how and what the next ref cycle will look like in terms of what, how things will balance out. I mean, at the moment, I'm assuming that you probably need to be able to do it all and deliver both, and that's going to be really challenging. Um, but potentially, if we do manage to shift a little bit how universities think about this more engaged scholarship, then it may be that some of these other ways of working and thinking will get more prominence and have more traction, because they do deliver what universities really value, which is authentic engagement with partners. That's something they have to deliver on as well. And there is a couple of, I don't know if anyone's looked at the KEF framework, but KEF has a couple of dimensions that are around stakeholder engagement for universities so looking up your own institution and its KEF picture is quite interesting, how it kind of rates in terms of working with people using services, but also stakeholders more generally. So there's that other metric for stakeholder engagement that's getting increasing prominence.
Yeah, and for those of you at Greenwich, it is now part of our strategy, and the CAF is mentioned multiple times. So hopefully that will also make a difference in terms of the way our institution judges us in terms of outputs or versus other types of engagement work that we might do.
And we found it really useful having one of our impact team came and explained to us our KEF, because it didn't really make any sense. So having that understanding why your institutional picture looks the way it is more important almost than the pretty picture, because it kind of is like ours looks like that because of this, and it was some very particular reasons, and it's been really useful for us with our strategy going forward.
Great. Claire, can you say more about the notion of authenticity in co-produced research and why this is important, Annette?
Yeah, I think this comes back to my point about the use of the label so very broadly. People I never thought I would hear use terms like co-production. We hear it in policy all the time, people talking about co-producing policy. And actually, I guess there's a whole area of research around co-production, what it means, which is very much underpinned by a set of kind of theoretical constructs and also values. And that I think to be proper co-produced work, it needs to align with those things. So there's Eleanor Elstrom's work, which I think is really useful in this area, really thinks very deeply about what it means to do co-production. So I think that to me is about the authenticity as something that's rooted in that body of thinking and is rooted in values that are around particularly this idea of mutuality. So a partnership that is giving benefit to both. So the example of not being authentic, given we're recording, I guess is for a lot of us is our work on the applied research collaborations, the NHR's ARCs, where those tend to be partnerships that are very dominated by universities, perhaps one university in each geographical area. Most of the resourcing runs through a particularly small part of the partnership. And that idea about being a kind of true partnership, a mutual partnership, probably isn't really what those partnerships look like in practice or feel for the people who are part of them. So, but we use the language of co-production in that space as well. So yeah, I think there is a way to go to see authentic co-production. That's a challenge for us
It's a case of language running faster than structures.
Yes. Yes.
Sally, resonate with the frustration of giving time to co-write a funding bid with multiple stakeholders, submitting it to a very tight closing date to a government department who then moved their dates to consider bids by 7 months. So much changes on the ground in 7 months. It feels like we are losing ground before we have begun. So Sarah,
Yeah.
Sally, we share your frustration, I'm sure, in different ways.
Absolutely. And I was talking to someone the other day who does work on in one of the North of England ARCs on pregnancy, and she'd got a big funding bid in. And by the time she found out she didn't have the money, the pregnant women had toddlers at home and weren't interested in, so there are real implications of kind of the funding cycle. And one of the issues I had with our partnerships project was that our non-academic partners couldn't even fill in the NHR or the form. It's so designed for a particular stakeholder group. It's just designed for universities. And so this is where people come in. And so actually colleagues within NHR in effect fill the form in for them to be co-applicants. So that, the systems are set up, all the systems are set up with a very traditional model of kind of academic knowledge production.
We're still stuck in the linear model, I think.
We certainly are, yes.
Ayomide is asking or saying, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on how you can actually know or measure that power has been shared.
Yeah, so we have some colleagues over in the US who've had some significant funding to think about measures for partnerships, and included in that is a measure of power. So that work is just coming to an end now. We're hoping to use their measures within our survey for our study. But one of the things that the team have said about those measures is they're very worried about how they might be used, because things like power is so context sensitive and changes all the time, that they're actually rather concerned, having developed these measures, that there will be a danger that they will be they'll capture a particular point in time, but that will be so far from how things were the day before or the day after, given the sensitivity of some of these things. So I can share with you when that comes out, if you're interested in how they've thought about them. They've got some really lovely ways of thinking about the measures, and they've had some quite significant funding to think about it. So that's been a real positive for us.
That sounds really interesting. Yeah, I'd love to see it as well. So we've got another comment from Richard. I was very taken with Professor Knott's use of multi-criteria decision analysis, I think, to unpack complex problems. Make criteria explicit and handle value judgments. Might similar approaches be helpful addressing power in relation to evidentially based policy research?
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, I often think it's just about having some kind of decision analysis tools to help us, that we, particularly when you're working with stakeholders, to have some shared and transparent things to help us think through issues and problems. And so that there are all kinds of things out there, aren't there? But they just help us with being much more explicit about what we're doing, and anything that helps us bring in values, because values are absolutely there all the time. And the trouble with kind of evidence-based thinking was that it was about pushing that to the side, whereas I think where we are now is much more about recognizing those values and working with them, and trying to understand where we're all coming from in terms of policy improvement. So that feels like a massive step forward, and finding tools to help us with that, can only be helpful.
Yeah, 100% agree. Fatima is saying another challenge, I guess, is incentivizing researchers to take part in stakeholder engagement, but it is time and resource consuming, but the results outcome are not easily measurable or tangible, especially to funders.
Yeah, definitely. This is a real issue, isn't it? I mean, so at the moment, the incentives for researchers really rely around, things like incentive. They're all around publishing, getting PhD students finished, applying for grants. We all know what we're meant to do, and that's I suppose a positive. At least we know what we're meant to be doing. And how you incentivize this kind of work, particularly given the investment of time, and particularly it's a great point that it actually showing that it's made a difference can be really difficult. One of the points of feedback we had on the work we've done, the Rebuilding a Resilient Britain work, was the academics really wanted to know what had happened to their individual input, whereas actually that's really hard, even from within government, to track what's happened to those bits of research, where they've gone. And so the evidencing is really super difficult. And I think things like prizes are great. So I think institutional prizes, things like the ESRC's Impact Prize, so ways of raising up and rewarding this activity. There are other ways that organisations can value this work. We have like kind of a little small fund in our institution so there's resource that people can access. And so there are little things we can do because this isn't expensive work. So actually, having ways of building in a little bit of support for people, a bit of skill in the institution to help with it, and also sharing our learning internally within the institution. So we've just had some really interesting cross-organizational meetings of people who work with stakeholders, and particularly our colleagues who work in Level South have some amazing learning from working in low resource environments on working with stakeholders, and really creative methods and really building long-term relationships. So I think that having maybe a little internal sharing session around what people have been doing in their work can be really positive, because we often don't get a chance to. I mean, there's all the problems we want to share, but also the workarounds we've found.
Actually, this could be a useful suggestion for us, or some of us at Greenwich, to kind of create avenues to do that kind of sharing and so on. And maybe this platform could be used for that in the future. I don't see any other questions in the chat. Does anybody want to ask a last minute question or comment? I'm going to give you 10 seconds.
Hi, Julia.
Hello.
Sorry, hi, Annette. Sorry, I just wanted to ask a quick question. I'm work on impact at the university, professional services. I'm actually just about to go into a session now to present on similar or related material. But yeah, I just wanted to follow up from what Fatuma said and what Julia commented on there, that certain key issues that I come up against at the university over and over again is all these drivers for engaged research and collaborative working, which, it's not only work, takes time to work with other partners, and engagement activities and events, they're so time and resource heavy. Quite often the timescales and the power is very much beyond your control because you're relying on an increasingly wider nets. And it's just a comment that I don't think universities have quite risen to the occasion to realize the kind of impact that needs to happen on BAW points and recognition. And to go back to Fatuma's point on intangible results, there are things like the KEF, which is meant to be capturing knowledge exchange in and of itself. It's recognizing the importance of that, but not much of that comes back to the individual research teams themselves. So I think sometimes that's why people pay lip service to this engaged research, because they just simply don't have the time, etc., to immerse themselves as in depth as they might need to. That's,
I think
sorry,
so.
it's just a comment more than a question.
It's really such an important point. It's about how far we've got to go, really, isn't it, for this to be embedded in our organizational culture. And one of the things we've been talking about in our organization is about how we embed this in our strategies. So this is part of all our strategies for the organization, and also that there's the leadership there that really value this work. So that has to come right from the top.
Yes, exactly. So we're just going to kind of continue to push for our to be properly resourced to be able to do this work, which seems to be a problem. I think in general, but particularly in those kind of more teaching-heavy institutions like Greenwich, that where there isn't as much research funding, perhaps some of them more research oriented, research heavy institutions. So yeah, something to contend with. And I'm really glad that Jean, who helps us to write impact case studies at the university, recognizes that we often don't have time to make compelling cases for impact, and it's not because we lack understanding or ideas. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. There's been an outpouring of love and gratitude in the chat, which I'm really pleased to see. And thank you so much, Annette, for taking the time to come and talk to us. This has been a very inspiring and learning session for us, for me anyway. I'm sure for other people too.
Me too. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Take care. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.